It is wonderful to be back at the Morgan Library, and we're going to be talking about transcendence this evening. And I have to say, I can't imagine a better place to have this conversation than in this room. I think Alan Lightman occupies a really distinctive place in our intellectual culture because he straddles several divides that are often very contested. He's both a scientist and a novelist, and he's also a staunch materialist who believes in the importance of spiritual experience. And when you read his books, his essays, and his fiction, you get a sense of his insatiable curiosity. We live in a wondrous and mysterious world, and he is continually exploring the question, how much can science explain the mystery? As I was reading about Alan's background, I was fascinated by some of his touch points. In college at Princeton, he studied Nietzsche under Walter Kaufmann, one of the great Nietzsche scholars, and later did his dissertation in physics at Caltech under Kip Thorne, who later won a Nobel Prize. 30 years ago, Alan burst into public awareness with his novel Einstein's Dreams, which has since been translated into 30 languages, I believe, maybe more, and which has also been adapted as an off-Broadway musical. He's written many books since then. His latest is The Transcendent Brain, Spirituality in the Age of Science, and he's had a distinguished career as an astrophysicist working on gravitation theory, black holes, the warping of space and time, and all kinds of cool stuff. So he spans multiple worlds, and I have to say, I wish that there were more people in the world like Alan Lightman. So please help me welcome Alan Lightman. It's great to have you here. So, Alan, there is a remarkable experience that you have written about when you were spending a summer in Maine and you had a close encounter with a couple of ospreys. Can you describe what happened?
Well, my wife and I have spent the last 30 years or so on a small island in Maine, and there's an osprey's nest that is a couple hundred feet from the house, and we have a very large picture window that looks out at the osprey's nest, and the ospreys are always coming and going. So instead of watching TV, we watch the osprey's nest. So the typical pattern of the ospreys is the parents who've been vacationing in South America come back in the springtime. The mother osprey lays eggs in April. The eggs hatch in June. And then the father starts going out and catching fish to feed the family. And the babies start growing up and getting bigger and bigger. And by mid-August, the babies are strong enough. They're adolescents by this time. They're strong enough to take their first flight. So one summer I'd been watching the family in this osprey's nest and watching the babies get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then I was standing on a second floor circular deck, and the growing children ospreys were looking at me as I was looking at them. So to them, it must have looked like I was in my nest because it's a circular deck. And so one afternoon, the two adolescents now took their maiden flight, the first time they'd ever left the nest. And an adolescent osprey is pretty big and strong. They have powerful claws, and the two adolescent ospreys on their maiden voyage took one loop out over the ocean and back towards me, maybe about a half-mile diameter. And they started flying straight at me. And at first I was very frightened because an adolescent osprey can rip your face off. And my first thought was to run back into the house, but something made me stand there. And I was looking at them coming at me at great speed. They were looking at me. And when they were about maybe 20 feet away, they suddenly made a very high G upward vertical climb and went over the roof of the house. But in the last second before they made that vertical climb, we made eye contact. And it was the most profound communication I've ever had with a non-human animal before, and also with some humans. I can't really describe in words what that moment was like, but it was something like, I mean, I felt like they were talking to me. It was something like, we've shared this land together. We're kindred spirits. It was something like that. And so that was the experience. And
The way you write about this, you said that you were shaking, maybe even crying.
I was shaking and I was in tears. I didn't realize that I was in tears, but after they flew away, I realized that I was in tears. It was just that electric an experience. So that's the Osprey story.
So I want to kind of try to unpack what happened there and why it was so profound, because it seems like there's something that can be very powerful about an eye-to-eye encounter with another animal, a non-human animal. And Jane Goodall writes about this kind of thing. Her first encounter with David Graybeard, the first chimpanzee she befriended. And what is it about this contact with a being outside of our own species that makes it so extraordinary?
Well, first of all, I felt that there was a mind behind the gaze in these two birds. And I don't know what it was about the look that made me feel that way, but I felt that. But also that a really intimate, powerful connection with a non-human species made me feel like I was part of nature. That we were all connected. That different species and different living organisms, I mean, I'm sure I wouldn't have felt this way with an amoeba, but you can't make eye contact with an amoeba. But I felt that there was a unity to life in the world.
How important was it that this all happened at a nonverbal level? Because, I mean, when we hear about experiences of awe, it's typically outside of language, it seems.
I don't think, I mean, I've tried to describe it to you just now, but I don't think that words would have been very adequate. And I do think that that our transcendent experiences, our experiences of feelings of awe are beyond the verbal level. I mean, they're more primitive than that. They're something very deep in us before language.
And I guess I'm wondering if that's partly what makes these experiences so powerful. That maybe words, I mean, you're a writer, so I mean, of course you are going to value the importance of words, but words also have a way of distancing us from actual experience. And so such a primal experience like that, maybe that's partly the power here?
I think so. I think you're right. I think words, as wonderful as they are, they're limiting. You know, it's just like the difference between reading a novel and seeing a film based on the novel. That when you're reading a novel, the reader creates a world in their imagination, and there are all different kinds of possibilities. But once you see the novel on film, the film writer and director and scriptwriter have selected one possibility out of the hundreds of possibilities that there could be. And I think that in a small sense that language does that also. It restricts the full range of emotions that we have.
Now, you've described this as a transcendent experience. What do you think you're transcending?
Well, that's a great question. Well, I'm transcending my physical body. I'm transcending my ego. I'm transcending my sense of self. I'm transcending the moment in time, because I think in these experiences, you're not aware of time, and you're not aware of place either. So time, place, ego, physicality, all of that is being left behind somehow. So that's what I think you're transcending.
Now, you have called yourself a spiritual materialist. Do you want to tell us what that means?
Well, I'm a materialist in that I think that the world is made of atoms and molecules. And even the magnificent experiences that we have, the mental experiences, I think, even though we don't understand exactly how they arise from atoms and molecules, I think ultimately that they do come from atoms and molecules. I don't believe there's any supernatural element. But I'm a spiritual person. I regard myself as a spiritual person in the sense that I have experiences like the communion with the ospreys. I appreciate beauty. I have a sense of awe when I look out on the ocean, and it just goes on forever until it meets the sky. I feel a connection to nature. I feel that I'm part of the larger world. I feel that there are things larger than myself. And all of those together are my concept of spirituality.
I mean, I'm interested in the language that you use, and especially the embrace of a word like spiritual, because there are a lot of materialists, a lot of atheists who don't like any talk of spirituality. I mean, they would consider it mushy thinking, and that's not you. You're going in a different direction.
Well, I think that all of us have spiritual experiences. I mean, seeing the birth of a baby, we all have experiences like that, whether we name them or not. I think they are spiritual experiences in the sense that I am defining it. Of course, a lot of people associate spirituality with God, and by God I mean an intelligent being that lives outside of time and space and that created the world with purpose and that sometimes intervenes in the physical world. And I respect those beliefs. I don't share them, but I think that we can have spirituality without believing in God. So you can believe in God or not believe in God, but we all have the kinds of experiences that I was describing.
But you are invoking religious language, I would say.
I'm invoking religious language, which is perfectly fine as far as I'm concerned. But I think organized religion is one thing. The personal experience of transcendence and spirituality, as I've defined it, that's a different thing. Of course, you can connect the two, but you don't have to connect the two. So for me, there's a difference between organized religion and the personal experience of spirituality.
Now, a lot of people who have had really powerful transcendent experiences, and I mean, examples might be people who've had near-death experiences or psychedelic experiences, they will sometimes describe these as more real than, truer than what they otherwise experience in daily life. Do you think, going back to your osprey story, was that truer in some sense about sort of the nature of reality, what you experienced, than, what otherwise you experience?
I don't know what reality is. And I don't think that scientists know what reality is. What we know about the world is what we experience and what we measure. So reality is a slippery slope that I prefer not to slide on. But I can say that experiences like the communion I had with the ospreys and other experiences that I'm sure that everyone here has had, that you have a sense of being alive in the world, which is different than taking your kids to school or going to the dentist appointment. It's a vivid moment of being present in the world. And I think those are some of the most beautiful moments that we have.
Yeah. So I want to sort of pick up this thread of religion and, how we talk about God and science. And obviously there has been a tremendously fraught relationship between science and religion, especially in the last few decades. Some people think they are irreconcilable. Plenty of other people think the two can coexist. What's your take on this?
Well, first of all, I separate spirituality from religion in the way that I've described it. But now we're talking about religion proper. I think in most religious traditions, God is a being that not only exists outside of time and space, but occasionally intervenes in the physical world to perform miracles. I mean, we have the parting of the Red Sea. We have Muhammad splitting the moon in two. There are, countless stories of miracles. And by miracle, I mean an event that cannot be explained in terms of logical laws, either now or in the indefinite future. And miracles are absolutely inconsistent with a scientific view of the world. Now, there are some religions like pantheism that identify God with nature. And that's completely consistent with science. And there's some, there might be a religious tradition, I'm not sure, where God was the clockmaker who set the clock in motion, but then stood back and did not intervene after that. And that's also consistent with science. Because
That's the deist position.
that's the deist position, right? That's the deist position. And that's also consistent with science because we will never know exactly how the universe started, although we have theories. But a being an all-powerful being that exists outside of time and space and occasionally steps in and performs a miracle, that is incompatible with science. And so that's my view.
So the religion that most scientists tend to love is Buddhism, especially Zen Buddhism.
Yes.
Do you go there as well?
I go to with Buddhism. In fact, I've gone to a Buddhist retreat myself. My wife is a pretty serious Buddhist. I embrace all of Buddhism except the rebirth idea.
Reincarnation.
So that I can't accept because as a scientist, that doesn't make sense to me. But I love everything else about Buddhism, especially the idea of impermanence, which of course science tells us over and over again that even the stars will burn out. And also the idea of being present, of mindfulness. I think that's a wonderful, lovely idea.
So I want to go back into your own background because you have a really interesting personal history, and you've written about how you kind of were this budding scientist at a really early age. You set up a little science lab in the closet of your bedroom? Is that right?
That's right.
What did you do there, and how old were you?
Well, I started doing scientific experiments probably around the age of 7 or 8. I made ugly stains on the carpet that my parents couldn't clean out, and I made explosions. I built rockets.
Well, you made explosions in your closet.
Not in my closet. No, in my closet I had lots of electrical equipment, capacitors, resistors, batteries, photocells. I had test tubes and chemicals. And I didn't actually do the experiments in the closet. The closet was where I kept everything.
Okay.
But I loved doing experiments. I loved building things. It's interesting. I think that a lot of scientists have start off that way. When I got into college, I realized that there were other science majors who were much, much better than me with their hands, and they became experimentalists. When I built things in my college labs, they blew up. and when they weren't supposed to. So I'm not very good as an experimentalist at the professional level. So I retreated into mathematics and became a theoretical scientist.
Did you know when you were doing those science experiments, I don't know, when you were 10 or 12 or whatever, did you know that you wanted to become a physicist then?
No. I probably didn't know what physics was, but I did physics-type things like making pendulums with weights on the end of strings and timing their periods. And I knew that I was interested in science. I was interested in how the world works. And I got pleasure out of building things. So I didn't know that I was going to be a physicist, but I just knew that I loved building things and exploring and finding out how things work.
Is that the core attraction of science to you, trying to figure out how the world works?
Yes, I think so. There's a great emotional satisfaction in discovering something where you're the first person who found out that thing. And even if it's a minor thing, if you're the first person who found out this thing about the physical world, and there's a truth to it. I mean, people can debate endlessly on what caused the Civil War, and with good arguments on all different sides, from the social, political, economic side. But when you find out something that's equivalent to the area of a circle is pi r squared, no one can deny the truth of that. And there's something very reassuring about being able to find something that you know is true. On the other hand, I think that all of the debating the Civil War, the causes of the Civil War, and all the questions that the humanities ask that don't have answers, like would we be happier if we lived to be 1,000 years old, or is it moral to steal food to feed your family? Why did the Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, why did he kill the old lady? That these questions without answers are also extremely valuable. And I think that both the questions of science, which have answers, and the questions of the arts and humanities, which don't have answers, they're all part of being human. We need questions with answers, and we need questions without answers.
Well, let me ask you about the other hat you wear, which is you're a novelist. And I'm just trying to figure out, how did you do this? How did you become a physicist, an astrophysicist doing all of this high-level theory, and also write all these novels? How did that kind of fit into your career trajectory?
Well, I was a writer from a young age. I wrote poetry, and then I wrote some bad short stories. So I had the dual interest in the arts as well as the sciences from a young age.
Did they have equal weight for you?
I think they did. And what I realized later, much later, was that I had two groups of friends. I had the friends who worked on the literary magazines, and I had the friends who entered the science fair. And I had these two groups of friends, and I never thought of them as being distinct. They were just people that I loved to be with and to talk to. And it was only much later that I began to realize that there are these two different sides of us. And our parents and our teachers and our friends push us to be one way or the other. They push us to either be the spontaneous, intuitive, artistic type, or they push us to be the rational, deliberate, scientific type. From a young age, they push us in one direction or the other because life is easier if you're in one camp or the other. But I think, in fact, that many of us have interest in both the sciences and the humanities and arts. I'm lumping the arts and humanities together for this conversation. And it's really a shame that we get funneled into one way of being versus the other.
Well, let me ask you about how different those ways of viewing the world actually are. So I think sort of the common assumption is that science is about trying to understand the material world, what is observable, whereas writing fiction is about creating imagined worlds. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair distinction?
Yeah, I think so. Another thing you could say is that the humanities and arts are ultimately about our inner world as human beings, our psychology, and the expression of our inner selves, whereas science, other than psychology, is about the external world. And all scientists believe that there is a physical reality outside of our minds. Not everybody believes that. In fact, there's some very well-known philosophers like George Berkeley who believe that everything is a mental construction. And you could argue that because, of course, everything that we know about the world is filtered through our brains. But the reason why I think that can't be true, that is, that everything can't be a mental construction, because if it were true, there would never be any surprises in science. And scientists are constantly surprised by things that we learn that disagree with our theory. There was the miasma theory of disease, that it came from bad air emanating from the earth. And there was the belief that light, the propagation of light, required a material medium people call the ether. And in those two cases and many others, we found by experiment that our theory, our conception was incorrect. And I think that if the world were totally a mental conception, mental construction, that we wouldn't have these surprises that we do.
So for you, who you've both had this career in science and also you've written many works of fiction, do these two different ways of thinking feed on each other? I mean, does writing fiction make you a better physicist?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. I think that there is an intuitive aspect to science, and I think that the greatest scientists like Darwin and Einstein have had very strong intuition about the world, which went beyond just the facts and the numbers. I think in my own fiction that I have been, I can see the effects of science, of a scientific background in my fiction, because my novels have greater organization than the average novelist. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good thing. It's just a feature of my writing. And some reviewers have pointed out that I have a lot of organization in my novels.
You kind of think like a scientist when you're writing a novel?
A little bit, but I've learned that it's bad. Well, in expository writing, we learn in high school that it's very good to start every paragraph with a topic sentence. And a topic sentence names the idea of the paragraph. It sort of guides your reader in how to think about the paragraph. But in fiction writing, a topic sentence is fatal, because you don't want to tell your reader how to think about the paragraph. You want them to be blindsided and to be carried off into that imaginary world that you're creating. You want the reader to bring their own life experiences into the reading of whatever it is. So that's a profound difference between fiction writing and non-fiction writing, which I take as a model for science.
Yeah. So we've been talking about kind of how you became a scientist and also how you became a fiction writer. I want to pick up the thread of your spiritual history, and because you've written about some fascinating experiences. One was when you were quite young, you say maybe 9 years old or so, you had almost an out-of-body experience,
Yes.
right? What happened there?
Well, I was standing in one of the bedrooms of my home in Memphis, Tennessee, and it was in the mid-afternoon, and there were some train tracks that were near our house, and I heard a train go by. And something about that triggered a very unusual experience that I suddenly felt like I was not in my body anymore, but I was in outer space. And I was sailing through the galaxies. I think at 9 years old, I knew that there was outer space and there were galaxies. And I felt like I was part of the cosmos. And I sort of had a sense of a very, very long period of time before I was born and a very, very long period of time after I would be dead. And I had a sense that I was an insignificant speck in the universe. And that was the experience that I had. And it just lasted like 1 minute. But
Any idea of what would have triggered that?
no, I don't know what triggered it. I mean, I know that the immediate thing was hearing this train go by, but I have no idea why that triggered this expansive feeling that I had. So I can't answer the question.
You know, what I find so interesting as you describe this is, I mean, you said it maybe lasted a minute, but it obviously made a huge impression on you.
Yes, it did. Well, don't we all have experiences that last a minute and have huge huge impressions on us? I think we all do.
Yeah.
Life is made up of those moments.
So as you've written about this, you have this wonderful line. You say, "Sometimes I wish I believed in the soul, but I've got mathematics." Can mathematics be a replacement for the soul?
Well, certainly not completely. But as I was saying a bit earlier to you in the green room, I think most religious traditions have, not saying, but many religious traditions have two souls. There's a universal soul that is not connected to you personally. And then there's your personal soul that has your own self-identity. The ancient Egyptian Ka and Ba, for example, the Ka was this universal soul, and the Ba was something that contained part of your individual identity. And the two souls left your body at physical death, and the Ba tried to rejoin with the Ka. So I think that mathematics is very close to this universal soul. It's not personal, but it has an immortality to it, because when we find, I mentioned earlier, the area of a circle is pi r squared. That's not going to change. And if we could talk to glyptons on the planet Poyak, they would know, as long as they were, reasonably intelligent, they would know some version of the area of a circle is pi r squared. They would know about the number pi, 3.1417, et cetera. And so that's what mathematics is for me. And the world of mathematics is a beautiful world.
Can you explain that? Because I mean, I'm not particularly mathematically inclined myself, but I've heard mathematicians talk about the beauty of math. What makes it beautiful?
the exactness, the purity. It's not contaminated with human prejudice. It's not contaminated with politics. If you see a mathematical proof, for example, the proof, which is fairly simple, that the square root of 2 is a number that cannot be expressed as the ratio of two whole numbers, cannot be expressed as a repeating decimal. It's something else called an irrational number. When you see the proof of that, you just say, wow. Or if you see the proof of the Pythagorean theorem, that if you have a triangle with one angle is 90 degrees, that the square of the side opposite that angle is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two legs of the triangle. When you see the proof of that, it's a beautiful thing. And it's hard. You're asking me to describe the beauty of it. It's precise, it's eternal, it's pure, and it's simple. And so those are aspects of beauty. I think that other people would describe beauty in a different way, but that's what, to a scientist or a mathematician, that's what beauty is.
Well, let me ask you about the Pythagoreans in ancient Greece, because, I mean, I know there was this kind of, this cult, I don't know if that's the right word, a religion, that believed there was something sort of eternal. I mean, eternal is not even the right word. I mean, there is a religious foundation to numbers, right? I mean, there was this whole religion sort of based on the idea that, you know, they're based on numbers. Does that do anything for you, that idea?
Yes, it does. There's this wonderful debate in mathematics about whether mathematics is something that we invent or is it something we discover. Are there mathematical truths out there that are independent of us? Or do we just invent all of the mathematical theorems? And I think that there is a mathematical world out there that we discover, although it takes, you know, human beings, at least the part of it that we know, it takes a discovery. But I think there's probably a lot of math out there that we don't yet know. And every year you see a new mathematical theorem that was postulated several hundred years ago and is now proven. So my view of that is the same as it is of science, that there's an external world out there that's independent of our minds.
So I want to pick up the thread of sort of where the religious impulse comes from for a lot of people, because I have a pet theory about this, and I'd love to run this by you. I tend to think that sort of at root, the reason why people are religious is it's not particularly because of, you know, how they read the Bible or any sacred scripture. It's not even really a set of beliefs. It's the rejection of the idea that it's just an accident that we're here. That I think that's just sort of intolerable for a lot of people. That, you know, it just like if circumstances were a little bit different, you know, I wouldn't be here. I think the core idea is that there's some underlying purpose, and we were meant to be here. And just the idea that if you're just going to throw that out the window, that is just unacceptable. I think for most people, actually.
I agree with you completely. I would add one more impulse that is involved with the creation of religion, and that is the desire for immortality. That is just too upsetting for most people to think that this physical body is all there is. You know, when I'm going to live my 87 years or whatever it is, and then I'm going to be no more. That is just a very grim thought for many people.
But it's not grim for you, I take it.
It's not grim for me. although I'm seeing more and more signs of my aging.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, you're in your mid 70s now, I know. Does the way you think about these questions, these existential questions about, why we're here, meaning, has that changed at all for you as you've gotten older?
I think it has. I think when you get to be a certain age, you start seeing the full arc of your life. And if you haven't asked the question before, you ask, have I done anything that's worth anything? Am I going to leave anything behind? So you begin asking those questions.
And for you, how do you start to answer those questions?
Well, I've my children, one of whom is sitting right here, who has 2 children of her own. So that's a very precious way of leaving something behind. I'll have good friends. I hope that some of my books will last, but I would be very surprised if anything I've written is still here 100 years from now. So that's something. One of the things that you've asked me how have I come to terms with my mortality, and I think that I used to think that only things that were permanent had meaning, that things that lasted a long time. And I've come around to the belief that the moment is what matters, like us, sitting here right now talking, this extraordinary, beautiful room. All of us right here are experiencing a moment. And I think that that's what matters, because nothing lasts. And if you don't at least appreciate the moment, then you don't have anything at all. And we're so caught up in the busy life that we lead that has been made more and more busy and frantic by the high-speed communication devices like our phones. We sometimes don't have the time to think about what's important, what our values are, and just experiencing the moment. I mean, we've all seen people walking in the forest looking at their phones, or at a restaurant looking at their phones. They're in hyperspace somewhere. They're nowhere. And at least we can be where we are at that moment, experiencing that moment. And I think that that's all there is.
That is wonderful. So well put. Let me ask you about another moment that you've written about. You were in Maine at your place there. You were out in a boat late at night alone, and something unusual happened. What can you describe? What
Yes.
happened there?
Well, I was coming back to this island that I live on with my wife and sometimes children, and it was after midnight, and there were no other boats out on the water, and it was a clear night, and I could see the stars, and I was in the ocean, and I decided to turn off the engine of the boat, and it got even quieter. And then I turned off the running lights of the boat and got even darker. And I lay down in the boat and just looked up. And after a few moments, I felt like I was falling into infinity. I felt like I was merging with the stars. And I lost all track of my body, lost track of time, lost track of where I was. It was another moment like the eye contact with the ospreys, where I felt like I was part of something much larger than myself. And I don't really know exactly how long I lay there because I had lost track of time. But at some point I got up and turned the engine back on and went to my dock. So that was another transcendent experience.
So I've had a couple of experiences that share some similarities with what you have talked about. One was, and they're very similar, these two. One was when I was hiking in the Waimea Canyon in Hawaii, and another was I was biking very slowly in this nature refuge on Sanibel Island in Florida. And I sort of like kind of went into some almost slightly altered state. I sort of felt a little tingling, and I had this powerful sensation that everything was right in the world. And it was sort of this merging with sort of the whole natural surround. I mean, they're both very beautiful places. And it didn't matter at all if I was there. And so, I mean, this was the feeling that I had at the time. It wouldn't even matter if humanity disappeared. Everything would be right in the world. And I don't know what to make of that. And I obviously sort of, I mean, yeah, my sense of self was still there, but it was sort of, my significance was sort of, I don't know, diminished. And I don't know, does that resonate with you in any way?
Yes, I think that's very similar to the moments that I described, and I think probably everybody here has had moments like that, and they are beautiful and
rare. I mean, I've had two like this in my life. I'd like to have another one.
Yes. Well, I wish we could order these up.
And yet, I mean, they're rare, and yet, as you say, there are moments they might just last. I mean, this probably lasted, I don't know, an hour at most for both of those for me, but it's kind of stayed with me. And, I still am I'm puzzling over what that is and whether is that a mystical experience? Somehow that language doesn't really work for me in some way, but it's sort of an ecstatic nature experience that seems right.
Well, you don't have to use the word mystical. There's a concept in Hinduism called darshan, Darshan, probably mispronouncing it, which is the opportunity to experience the sacred. And the sacred could be God, the sacred could be the universe, the sacred could be nature. And it's recommended to us that we be open to darshan, that we be open to the world and be open to these experiences like the kind that you described and the kind that I described.
And I guess then the question is what are the conditions that open us up to it? And so you have a chapter in your recent book, The Transcendent Brain, where you speculate on the origins of spirituality, and you suggest that it's a spandrel. In other words, it's not sort of a fundamental part of evolution. It's kind of a byproduct of evolution. Can you explain this?
Well, there are many aspects of spirituality, but I think that all of them, in my view, either had direct survival benefit or are byproducts of traits that had survival benefit. One example is our feeling of connection to nature, like I had with the ospreys. And if you go back in our evolutionary history, say a couple of million years ago, we lived in caves, and the selection of a place to live was the most fundamental thing that a group of people could do. If you've chosen the right place to live, you know who your predators are, you know where to find food, you know where to find shelter. You might need to be near a lake or a river. And so there was very strong survival benefit in being tuned to nature. And so, I'm talking like 100,000 generations ago.
But being tuned to nature is one thing, and sort of trying to kind of trace these sort of these extraordinary experiences that we have that are somehow connected to evolution, to somehow our genetic makeup. How far can you go with that?
I think you go pretty far. I think that our affinity for nature is hardwired into our DNA, and that it goes back to when being attuned to nature was a strong survival benefit. I also think that our feeling connection to other people, if we go back to that same cave, when we were, some people went out to get food, other people had to stay in the cave and keep the fire going or take care of the children. And you really depended upon your community for survival. And if you got separated from the group, it was almost certain death. If you wandered out from the cave on your own. And so we really have this codependence on a community as a necessary survival trait. And there are social anthropologists who have argued that our feeling of connection to nature and our feeling of connection to other people are very closely related to each other.
And I get all of that. I guess my question is how far you can really take scientific explanations, and in this case, evolutionary explanations, for trying to explain these deep spiritual impulses. Because there is another way that you could just say they are. You can't necessarily pinpoint the cause. These things happen. But maybe that you don't go there, right?
Well, I think that Charles Darwin had a lot to say about this. And in his identification of various traits in different animals, he was able to argue pretty convincingly that those traits had survival benefit because they were identified with particular locations and environments from which the animals emerged. And modern molecular biologists who look at the DNA of humans and non-human animals, they see a continuity there. And so those kinds of arguments convince me. I think that many of the distinctive traits that we have had survival benefit.
Well, let me just pick up on one of those. I mean, Darwin, of course, is famous for his study of birds, and there's this question of, why do certain bird species sing? Sometimes beautiful songs, and the common explanation is, it has something to do with reproductive success. I've heard a few people say maybe it's just because they like to sing.
Maybe they're just happy.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that you could make that argument. There are certain animals now, like guppies, tropical guppies, whose DNA evolves very rapidly. And some modern evolutionary biologists and ecologists have done experiments by putting guppies in various habitats. And they have been able to see over the course of several generations that the guppies actually change their bodily characteristics to fit the habitat they're in. And the habitat itself also changes to fit the population of guppies that are there. And the DNA actually changes over the lifetime of a single, of an experiment. And so that kind of experiment convinces me that it's not that birds don't sing just because they like to sing. Now, I'm sure that birds do like to sing, and it might express some pleasure in the world, but I do think that there's probably an evolutionary origin of the singing of birds.
I mean, sort of my larger question here is, if you were a secular humanist, which I think you would describe yourself as, do you pretty much have to, for sort of the intellectual argument to hold together, do you pretty much have to go back to sort of looking for evolutionary explanations for something like spirituality, something like the origins of religion, as opposed to saying there's just some fundamental mystery there that we really can't explain, like why people develop these feelings or these experiences?
I think you can argue either way. I mean, I like mystery, so I certainly think that there are a lot of things that we don't understand. So I would accept that argument. But in trying to find a reconciliation of science and spirituality, which is part of my mission, my aim is to try to find a scientific explanation for these things. And in doing so, I don't discount at all the magnificent and majesty of these experiences we're talking about. But it's just that this is a way that I can imagine both a scientific and a spiritual world that are the same world.
You know what I find so interesting is, I mean, you are carving out this space between, on the one hand, the hardcore atheists like Richard Dawkins, you know, who have absolutely no patience for religion at all, and on the other hand, people who are, you know, very religiously minded, who really reject the strictly materialist worldview, and you know, they talk about scientism, you know, science trying to explain everything. You're trying to find some middle ground there, and I guess I'm wondering what's at stake here for this, and why does this matter?
I think that science and religion are the two most powerful forces that have shaped civilization. And of course, I've given my version of religion, which I favor, which is not organized religion, but these personal experiences that we have. And religion is not going away, science is not going away. They're both part of who we are. And one thing I don't like about Dawkins is he just dismisses religion and people of faith altogether. He says they're ignorant. And I think that's condescending and it's offensive. I think that you know, the amazing thing about human beings is that we are both rational and intuitive. We're scientists and we're artists, we're painters, we have spiritual experiences. We can also work out that the area of a circle is pi r squared. We have all of these capacities. It's just amazing. The human brain is the most complex object that we know of in the universe. It's more complex than a star. It's more complex than an entire galaxy. And it's just extraordinary what our brains are capable of. I think that non-human animals have extraordinary brains too. I don't think that they have the level of consciousness that we do, but I think that they have, you know, pretty amazing brains too. So I'm just constantly amazed and in awe of what the human brain is capable of.
So I have one last question before we throw it to our audience here, and I'm sure they're going to have questions for you. We are in the world of AI now. Mm-hmm. Do you think AI will ever have spiritual experiences?
Well, let's start with consciousness, which is the foundation for all mental experiences. So I think if you made a list of all of the manifestations of consciousness, like being able to plan for the future, being able to express a sense of self, knowing where you are in space and time. If you made a list of all of the attributes of consciousness, I think that pretty soon we will have a computer that checks all the boxes. But whether that thing is conscious or not is a totally different question.
In other words, it might look conscious, but
it might look
but
conscious. It might behave like a conscious thing. But when you come down to it, consciousness is a feeling. You know, it's sensation from all of those chemical and electrical exchanges between neurons that's going on, and somehow, in a way that we don't understand, and maybe never will understand, it produces this feeling that we have. the feeling of being present in the world, of having a self, of having memory, of being able to plan for the future, of being able to integrate all the sensations of sight and sound that come in. And I don't know how we can ever know what a computer feels. So start there
Before we get to spiritual experience.
before we get to spirituality.
So the verdict is out for you, is what it sounds like. We just don't know. It might happen, but we don't know.
What I'm sure of is that we will be able to build a computer in the future that checks all the boxes of the manifestations of consciousness. But I don't think that we will know whether it's conscious or not.
Unless maybe it starts doing some really weird stuff, because we might just guess it's feeling in some way.
Well, even then, we wouldn't know. But an interesting question for me is that once we build this very advanced AI, and it has all the manifestations of consciousness, do we have any moral obligation to it? And there are ethicists right now who are pondering this, and there'll be more and more in the coming decade. For example, do we have to ask it permission to unplug it? And there'll be all kinds of issues like this that arise as we get the successors to ChatGPT and the future advanced AI.
Okay, on that note, that is perfect for opening it up to our audience. So there are a couple of mics here, so if you just want to raise your hand if you have a question you want to ask.
Well, it could be beyond our brain to understand it. I do think that consciousness comes from the material brain. So I don't think that there's a supernatural element to the brain. In other words, I think the mind and the brain are the same thing. That said, it may be that we are never able to fully to understand how this feeling that we call consciousness, how it emerges from the material neurons. There's a concept in science that's been developed over the last 25 years or so. It's called emergent phenomena. And these are phenomena that emerge from complex systems of many parts in which we understand the workings of the individual parts, but don't understand how those parts all work together. And one example of an emergent phenomena are certain species of fireflies that you get a group of these fireflies together in a field at night in the summer, and they begin by blinking randomly, like Christmas tree lights. But after about a minute or so, they start blinking in synchrony. And we understand everything about the chemical reactions that make light in an individual firefly, but we don't really understand how this group of fireflies starts blinking in synchrony. Another example are termite cathedrals. These are these magnificent mounds that termites build that have these intricate passageways to control airflow and humidity. And you wonder, how did the termites know to build that thing? There's no boss termite. There's no architectural plan. In fact, individual termites are blind. But somehow, this collection of 10,000 termites built this magnificent thing. So we think, we being neuroscientists, believe that some of the magnificent behaviors of the human brain, like consciousness, are emergent phenomena. That although they come from material neurons, and the connections between them, that we don't understand how that activity produces the sensation that we call consciousness. So I don't know whether that's an answer to your question or not, but that's the best answer I can give. Well, first of all, that must have been a very powerful experience for you. And no one can deny the experience that you had. I think science needs to be open to all possible phenomena. And so if there are certain experiences that don't now lie within the realm of science, I think science should investigate them, but investigate them the way that scientists do, which is with experiment and demanding evidence. But I think that in principle, every phenomena should be open to scientific investigation.
But let me follow up on that, because there are, I mean, I've heard many stories like that, and those, I'm not even sure how you would investigate that. I mean, these are the kinds of stories. This is not repeatable. I mean, this is the challenge of investigating something like this, and you can sort of go through. Could the person have heard this any other way? I mean, how do you investigate something like this?
I don't really know. It's true that when you have unique one-time experiences, it's really very, very impossible to investigate scientifically. But the kind of experiences that you had is related to the experiences that some people have when they're on the verge of death. And so I think that the way that science would investigate that is to, it would be a terrible intrusion on the privacy of the person and the family, but to do tests of people that were, and when I say tests, it might involve hooking electrodes up to their heads or something. It'd be terribly invasive and disrespectful, but you would have to have as subjects people who were on their deathbed. To me, as a scientist, that's the way that such a thing would be investigated. But a one-time event. Now, there is an exception to the one-time event question, and that is that scientists do believe, have a pretty solid theory of the origin of our universe, the Big Bang, and that was a one-time event. And why do we have confidence in this theory, the Big Bang theory? It's because the theory that we have of the origin of our universe makes a number of predictions about the current universe, which we can test. So that's the way that we test one-time events, if they have consequences that can then be tested. Well, that's a great question. Of course, I don't know the answer to that. But I know you're going to hit me over the head with this, but I think that hope probably had survival benefit. I think optimism probably had survival benefit. If you're just a pessimist and you've lost all hope, then you go into your cave and you lie down and you don't get up and you don't procreate and you don't pass on your hopeless genes. So that's the best answer that I can give. All I can say is that I was experiencing something in the moment, and even though I wasn't looking at my watch, in fact, I didn't even know whether I had an arm or a hand to look at. I was existing in the moment, and yet I did have. If I hadn't been in the moment, I wouldn't have had the experience at all. But you're right. I was connecting to something that was timeless, and so it is an interesting paradox. And I don't think I have any more light to shed on it, but I think you have to be in the moment to feel the vastness of the cosmos. But of course, when you're having one of these transcendent experiences, which I've described and Steve has described, you do lose track of time. So when we say you're in the moment, in a way, that's a paradox right there, because you've lost track of time. So maybe when we use the word moment, we're meaning something other than chronological time. We mean something like being present, being alive. That's about all I can say.
That is so beautiful. What a perfect note to end this on. Thank you so much, Alan Lightman, and thank you.
Thank you.